The morning briefing began the way it always did, with Captain Marcus Webb standing before a map pinned to the canvas wall of the operations tent, his finger tracing a route that had become as familiar to him as the scar tissue on his left palm. The map showed the sector north of the supply depot, a corridor of terrain that his unit had covered 43 times in the past 6 weeks. He knew this because Sergeant Donald Hayes kept a tally scratched into the wooden frame of his bunk, not out of obsession, but out of the simple soldier's need to mark time, to count the days remaining until rotation, to know that each completed patrol brought him one step closer to the world beyond this encampment. The morning light was thin and gray, filtering through gaps in the tent canvas, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of truck engines turning over suggested that other units were beginning their own day. Webb was 41 years old, with the kind of face that had weathered into permanence, not weathered by years of sun and hardship alone, but by the particular exhaustion of command, by the accumulated weight of small decisions made in conditions of incomplete information. He had been in the Pacific Theater for 18 months, and his hands bore the signatures of that time. Calluses from weapon handling, a pale line where his wedding ring had been before he sent it home, and a burn scar on his wrist from a gasoline spill during the reorganization of supply after the typhoon 3 months prior. His uniform was clean but worn, the fabric faded in irregular patches where sweat had stained it repeatedly during previous operations. He wore his rank without the self-consciousness of younger officers. Command had simply become the contour of his body by now. The unit under his direct command consisted of 28 men, though at any given time no more than 22 were fully operational. There was always someone in the medical tent, nursing an infection or a minor wound, someone on administrative duty, someone awaiting replacement after rotation. The core group, the men he actually took into the field, numbered 14, and he could have identified each one blindfolded by gait alone. There was Sergeant Hayes, compact and efficient, a former railroad dispatcher from Ohio, who had the particular talent of making men want to work harder, simply because they did not wish to disappoint him. There was Private First Class Thomas Rayleigh, a rifleman with hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from a nervous system that had been calibrated differently at birth. Webb had learned that Rail actually performed better under stress, his focus sharpening as his hands steadied. There was Corporal James Quan, whose parents had been interned in California, and who carried that knowledge into the field with a quiet intensity that Webb had come to recognize as deep patriotism rather than anything easily named. There was Private William Garrett, the radio operator, whose ability to maintain contact with headquarters had saved the unit, at least 2 occasions, when coordination with artillery support had made the difference between clean extraction and what could have been a much more difficult situation. The patrol route itself was a compromise between tactical necessity and the reality of available resources. The supply line running north from the main depot had been targeted twice in the past month, and headquarters had mandated increased reconnaissance along the access road. The route Webb traced covered approximately 15 kilometers of accessible terrain, winding through dense secondary growth punctuated by open rice paddies, and a series of small settlements that had been largely abandoned during the previous months. The pattern was to move out at dawn, establish observation posts at 3 predetermined locations, conduct a visual sweep using binoculars, and when available, the field telescope, move through the settlements to check for signs of recent enemy activity, and return to base by mid-afternoon. The operation took 5 hours when everything proceeded normally, 7 hours when they had to conduct a more thorough search or when weather delayed movement. Webb's finger moved from one point on the map to another, speaking in the low, clear tones that his men had learned to recognize as indicative of her operation. Hayes stood to his right, notebook already open, already writing, his shorthand notation a cipher that only he and Webb could read. The other officers, present Lieutenant Charles Foster, who handled logistics and rotation scheduling, and Second Lieutenant Marcus Ellison, who managed ordnance and equipment maintenance, listened without interrupting. The briefing was not really for them. It was for Webb himself. The act of speaking aloud the patrol sequence, a way of checking his own thinking, of ensuring that he had not overlooked anything. The morning was the same as most other mornings, which meant that it carried within it the deep comfort of repetition. The men knew the schedule, knew the terrain, knew what was expected. There was a rhythm to these operations, and rhythm was what kept men alive, what allowed them to move through dangerous terrain with the kind of automatic competence that freed mental energy for actual threat assessment rather than dividing attention between procedure and survival. Webb had learned this in the early days of his command, when he had tried to vary operations to keep the enemy off balance. What he had discovered instead was that variation meant his men performed less efficiently, were more prone to mistakes, were more likely to suffer injuries from inattention to familiar hazards. Routine was a form of safety, even when routine moved through terrain that was objectively dangerous. The unit was moving out at 6:30 hours. Webb's watch, a Belova that had belonged to his father, its face scratched but still functional. It was 0540. The men would already be checking their weapons, reviewing the medical supplies, ensuring that their canteens were with water that had been treated with purification tablets. These preparations happened without order. They had become the automatic morning ritual of soldiers who understood that the difference between adequate preparation and insufficient preparation could be the difference between clean completion and disaster. Webb knew his men were ready. The question was whether the terrain would cooperate, whether the weather would hold, whether the enemy would maintain the pattern of activity that had been documented over the previous 6 weeks. At 0628, rolled up the map, careful not to crack the folds too sharply, and stepped out of the tent into the gray morning. The sky was overcast, but not threateningly so. The temperature was cool, the humidity already beginning its relentless climb. The men were assembled in formation at the rally point, weapons held across their chests, expressions neutral in the particular way of soldiers who had learned to keep their emotions until they could assess whether a day would be ordinary, or whether it'd be one of the days that would be remembered. Webb looked across the faces and saw competence. He saw men who had trained together, understood their roles, who would move together as a functioning organism through the familiar terrain. Hayes approached from the left, notebook closed, ready. Webb began to move toward the vehicles, 3 jeeps equipped with mounted reconnaissance equipment and enough firepower to defend themselves if they encountered light resistance. The men fell into their assigned positions with the ease of routine. The engines started, and the convoy began to move out through the gate, heading north toward the supply road and the sector that awaited them. Everything was as it always was, which was precisely why Webb felt the first thin thread of something beneath his calm, a whisper of change, a recognition that the pattern of weeks was about to be interrupted by something neither the map nor the briefing could have foreseen. But he said nothing, and the convoy disappeared into the morning haze. The orders arrived at 400 hours on a Thursday, delivered in person by Major Richard Hollister, who rarely left headquarters except when the nature of the briefing demanded his presence. Hollister was a career officer with the kind of bearing that suggested he had never questioned a direct order, and did not expect anyone under his command to question one either. He sat across from Webb in the operations, a leather folder open on the table between them, and began to explain what the next operation would entail. The supply depot had been receiving intelligence reports indicating increased enemy activity along the ridge system that ran parallel to the supply road. Approximately 12 kilometers north of the current observation positions. The reports were not specific, no confirmed troop movements, no documented encampments. But they were consistent enough that headquarters had made the decision to expand the reconnaissance footprint. Webb's unit was being asked to conduct a 3-day operation that would push the observation zone further north, establish new forward positions, and conduct a more thorough sweep of the ridge system and the valleys that fed into it. The scope of the operation was larger than the routine patrols that Webb had been conducting. Instead of the 14-man corps group moving through familiar terrain in a single day, Webb would be taking 22 men pulling people from administrative duties and from the rotation schedule, and would be operating out of forward positions for extended periods. The mission objective was not combat, but reconnaissance and denial. If enemy activity was being conducted in the ridge system, the presence of a strong American patrol would disrupt it, would force any organizing forces to relocate, would gather intelligence about the nature and scale of that activity. The operation would require establishing a base camp approximately 8 kilometers north of the current limit of patrol, resupplying that position with food, water, and helicopter drops, and maintaining security while conducting systematic reconnaissance sweeps. The timeline was compressed. The operation would begin in 72 hours on Sunday morning. Webb listened without interrupting, a skill he had cultivated over 2 decades of military service. Hollister explained the strategic context. The supplies moving north were destined for a larger operation planned for the following month, and ensuring the security of that supply line was now a priority. The enemy had demonstrated an ability to interdict supply movements and to inflict casualties on escort units. Headquarters believed that establishing a forward American presence would alter the calculus enough to make future supply runs safer. It was logical. It was necessary. It was also substantially more ambitious than the operations Webb had been conducting, and it carried within it a proportionally larger margin for things to go wrong. When Hollister finished, Webb asked the necessary questions. What was the intelligence basis for the report? Hollister explained that it came from multiple sources, observation posts maintained by other units, prisoner interrogations, and analysis of supply interdiction patterns that suggested organized activity rather than random harassment. The quality of the intelligence was not exceptional, but it was sufficient to warrant investigation. What were the resource allocations? Webb would have his 22 men, 3 additional jeeps with mounted weapons, 2 helicopters for resupply and emergency extraction, and liaison with the artillery battery located at the depot. If the situation deteriorated, fire support could be directed to his position within 20 minutes, though the terrain in the ridge system would complicate that support. Webb understood what that meant. 20 minutes was a long time, and artillery support in mountainous terrain was less predictable than support in open ground. After Hollister departed, Webb spent an hour reviewing maps with Hayes and Ellison. The proposed base camp location was in a small valley that offered some protection from observation while maintaining visual access to the ridges above. The terrain would be challenging. The approach would require moving through a narrow pass that offered no alternative routes, and that could easily be ambushed if the enemy possessed sufficient force and tactical knowledge. Once in the valley, the unit would be relatively secure from direct assault, but supply and extraction would be entirely dependent on helicopter operations, and on the assumption that the landing zone would not be directly observed by enemy forces. The resupply drops would be visible, would generate noise, and would require the unit to be on the ground and exposed during the operation. Every assumption in the plan carried embedded risk. Ellison raised the practical concerns first. The jeeps being allocated to the operation were all older models, 3 years in theater with engines that had been repaired multiple times. Fuel consumption was high, and spare parts inventory was limited. Moving 22 men plus supplies for 3 days would push the weight capacity of the vehicles, would reduce fuel efficiency further, would mean fewer spare parts could be transported in case of mechanical failure. The ammunition allocation was also a concern. 22 men equipped for extended patrol would require substantial ammunition reserves, and carrying reserves meant less space for food and water, which in turn meant either shorter rations or dependence on resupply. Ellison was not suggesting the operation was impossible, but he was documenting the constraints, creating the record that if something went wrong, the failure could not be attributed to inadequate equipment or supply planning. Hayes was quieter, but Webb knew him well enough to read the question beneath the silence. This was substantially beyond routine patrol. This was an operation that assumed the enemy was present in the area, and that the unit would be expected to conduct themselves accordingly. The men had not fought in sustained engagements. The unit's history was relatively bloodless, scattered incidents rather than pitched battles. 17 men in the unit had combat experience from previous tours or earlier in the war. 5 men had no combat experience at all, taking a force that was largely untested through unfamiliar terrain. In an area where enemy activity was suspected but unconfirmed, was a different proposition than moving through known territory where the risk profile was already established. Webb understood all of this, and he understood that Hayes was understanding it too. They did not need to discuss it at length. Hayes would ensure that the men were prepared, that ammunition was distributed, that leadership understood the operational context. He would also ensure that if men were afraid, they understood that fear was normal, and that professionalism meant moving forward despite it. The operation would proceed because the operation had been ordered, and because the task itself, reconnaissance and denial, was one that the unit was equipped to perform. The risks were real, but they were not unreasonable. The intelligence, while imperfect, was sufficient to justify investigation. The resources allocated were adequate, if not lavish. This was what military service meant at the ground level, taking in complete information and available resources and making the best possible attempt at completion. On Friday, Webb individually with the 5 men who had no combat experience. Private Raymond Chen, Private Oscar Gutierrez, Private Edward Sullivan, Private James Whitmore, and Private George Kowalski sat across from him in the operations tent, each man slightly tense, each man aware that this conversation was because they were about to be asked to do something beyond their previous experience. Webb spoke to them plainly. The operation carried risk. The risk was real, and he would not insult them by pretending otherwise, but that the risk was manageable. They would move as part of a trained unit, under established command structures, with clear procedures for communication and for response to contingencies. They would not be going into combat. The objective was reconnaissance, not engagement. If they encountered enemy forces, the priority would be to withdraw, to maintain unit cohesion, to report what they had learned. Webb had commanded enough operations to know that experienced men often died from panic and loss of cohesion. Disciplined men who knew their jobs and trusted their leadership more often came home intact. By the end of Friday, the 5 men seemed steadier, seemed to understand that they were part of something that structure and purpose beyond their individual anxiety. On Saturday morning, the convoy assembled at dawn to review the route to the forward base camp. The pass that led to the valley was narrow, winding, and utterly exposed. Webb stood at the point where the convoy would have to slow down, where the vehicles would be most vulnerable to hostile fire, and felt the weight of the decision settling into his chest. The operation was necessary. The intelligence justified it. The risk was proportional. And yet, standing at the pass, looking at the elevation changes and the sight lines that could be used by someone with a rifle, Webb understood that he was making a choice to move his men through terrain where things could go wrong very quickly, and that no amount of justification would change that reality. The radio crackled at 0347 hours, pulling Webb from the thin sleep he had managed to achieve in the forward base camp. The voice on the other end was Corporal Kwan, who was manning the northern observation post approximately 2 kilometers ahead of the main position. Kwan's voice was steady, but Webb heard the undertone, the particular register that indicated something had shifted. Enemy movement had been detected along the line, approximately 5 kilometers to the northeast. The movement appeared to be organized, possibly a supply convoy or a troop repositioning. Kwan estimated the force at between 30 and 50 personnel, equipped with what appeared machine guns and small arms. The force was moving from northeast to southwest, parallel to the ridge, and would likely pass within an observation range of the forward position within the next 6 hours. Kwan was requesting permission to maintain observation and to report updated intelligence as the situation developed. Webb acknowledged and told Kwan to maintain position and to report any changes. He then ended the transmission and sat in the darkness of the tent, understanding that the mission had just transformed from reconnaissance to something more urgent and more dangerous. By 04:05 hours, Webb had assembled Ellison and the squad leaders in the tactical operations area of the base camp. The map was laid out again, marked now with the last known position of the enemy force and the probable trajectory. If the force continued on its current vector, it would move through terrain that offered multiple routes, would pass within engagement range of their forward positions, and would eventually approach the supply road that the original mission had been designed to protect. The size of the force was significant. With 22 men, Webb had local numerical inferiority. The enemy force appeared to be equipped with at least light crew-served weapons, which would give them a firepower advantage. The terrain in the engagement area was mixed open ridge-top, dense secondary growth in the valleys, narrow defiles that could be used to channel movement or to set ambushes. Webb considered the options with the focused clarity that came from years of making decisions under pressure. The first option was to maintain position at the base camp and allow the enemy force to pass. If Kwan maintained observation and reported accurately, Webb could pass the intelligence to headquarters, and the artillery battery at the depot could be directed to intercept the force or to inflict casualties as it approached the supply road. This approach minimized the direct risk to Webb's unit, preserved the unit's position and resources, and allowed the use of superior firepower. The artillery battery was equipped with weapons, could reach the engagement area, and could deliver far more destructive force than the light arms available to the patrol unit. The disadvantage was that the intelligence would be delayed. By the time the information reached headquarters was processed and was transmitted to the artillery, the enemy force would have moved. The interception would be probabilistic rather than certain. The force might disperse, might take shelter, might reach the supply road before the artillery could be effectively directed. The mission would be completed, information gathered, headquarters informed, but the opportunity to disrupt the enemy operation would be partially squandered. The second option was to move the entire base camp unit north, to concentrate force against the enemy column as it passed through terrain that offered engagement opportunities, and to attempt to inflict casualties sufficient to disrupt the operation. This approach would maximize the damage done to the enemy force, would demonstrate American presence and capability, and would potentially prevent the force from reaching the supply road. The disadvantage was immediate and substantial. Moving the entire unit north meant abandoning the base camp, moving through terrain that the unit had not thoroughly reconnoitered, moving toward an enemy force that was larger and equipped with weapons that gave it a firepower advantage. It meant accepting the reality that combat would likely be necessary, that casualties were probable, and that the unit could be overrun or cut off from retreat if the tactical situation deteriorated. It was the aggressive option, the option that took the initiative, and it was also the option with the highest cost if things went wrong. The third option was a variation on the second. Webb could move a substantial portion of the unit north, perhaps 12 to 14 men, to establish an ambush position along the route that the enemy force would likely take. The remaining 8 to 10 men could maintain the base camp, could maintain communication with headquarters, and could serve as a reserve position or as a point of extraction if the ambush force needed to withdraw. This approach distributed the risk, maintained flexibility, and allowed for partial engagement without committing the entire unit. The disadvantage was that it divided force at a time when concentrated force might be necessary. An ambush that was effective enough to disrupt a force 30 to 50 personnel required careful positioning, adequate firepower, and the element of surprise. With 12 to 14 men, Webb could establish an effective ambush, but the margin for error was small. If the enemy force adapted, if the ambush was discovered before it could be sprung, if reinforcement was available to the enemy force, the ambush unit could be in serious difficulty. Webb looked at Hayes, whose expression conveyed he understood the calculation. Ellison was focused on the map, already thinking through the logistics of movement and the supply considerations that came with any option that involved sustained engagement. The other squad leaders, Sergeant Thomas Miller, Sergeant Robert Adamski, and Corporal David Fuentes, were listening, already beginning to think about how they would move their men, what equipment they would need, what contingencies they would need to plan for. The decision crystallized for Webb not as a sudden flash of clarity, but as a gradual settling into understanding. The enemy force represented a genuine threat to the supply operation that the larger campaign depended on. The intelligence that Quan was gathering was valuable. But intelligence alone was insufficient. The force was allowed to proceed unopposed. If Webb maintained position, if the intelligence was delayed, if the artillery support was not effectively coordinated, the force would reach the supply road, would conduct whatever operation it had been organized to conduct, and would inflict casualties on American personnel who did not have any warning that the force was approaching. That risk was real, and it belonged at least partially to Webb, now that he knew the force was coming. Simultaneously, Webb understood that committing the entire unit to combat against a numerically superior force in terrain that was not fully reconnoitered was a decision that could result in catastrophic casualties for his men. The base camp had been established with defensive strength fields of fire that had been carefully cleared, supply positions that were defended, communication equipment that was redundant. Abandoning that position meant losing those advantages and moving into terrain where those advantages did not exist. Webb made the decision to split the force. 12 men would move north under Hayes' command, would establish an ambush position along the most likely route of the enemy force, and would engage when the force was in the ambush zone. 10 men would remain at the base camp under Ellison's command, would maintain communication with headquarters, and would be prepared to provide extraction support or to reinforce if the tactical situation required it. The objective of the ambush was not to destroy the enemy force. That was beyond the capability of the unit, but disrupt it, to inflict enough casualties to compromise the operation, to demonstrate American presence. Webb understood that this meant accepting the reality that men would likely be killed or wounded. He understood that the division of force meant that the ambush unit would not have overwhelming firepower, would not have a large margin for error, and would depend on tactical execution and on the continued advantage of prize. At 0530 hours, Webb briefed the 12 men who would move north. He explained the situation clearly, without minimizing the risk. He explained that the objective was disruption, not destruction, and that if the tactical situation shifted, if the enemy force was larger than anticipated, if reinforcement arrived, if the ambush priority would be to withdraw, preserve the unit, to maintain cohesion. He did not ask for volunteers. These were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders. But he looked each man in the eye as he explained what was being asked, and he saw the acknowledgement of understanding, the recognition of the stakes, and the acceptance of the mission. At 0555 hours, the ambush force moved out of the base camp, heading north toward the ridge line, and toward an encounter that would define the remainder of the operation, and would force Webb to understand the true distance between planning and consequence. The first report came at 847 hours. Hayes' voice on the radio was clipped, controlled, but Webb heard the sound of gunfire underneath it, the distinctive rhythm of small arms mixed with something heavier, probably a machine gun. Hayes reported that the enemy force had been engaged, that the ambush had been effective in the initial moments, but the enemy was responding with organized fire and was attempting to maneuver around the ambush position. Hayes was maintaining position, was inflicting casualties, but was assessing that the enemy force was larger than originally estimated and appeared to have additional personnel and weapons moving to support the engaged force. Webb acknowledged and told Hayes to maintain position, to keep communication open, and to report any developments. Ellison was already moving, already coordinating with the helicopter support to ensure that evacuation capability was available if needed, already beginning to calculate whether the reserve force at the base camp should move to support Hayes or should remain in defensive position. By 0920 hours, the situation had clarified in terrible ways. Hayes reported that Private Edward Sullivan had been killed in action, struck by machine gun fire, while moving to reinforce the eastern flank of the ambush position. Sullivan was the young private, the one with no combat experience, who Webb had spoken to just days earlier in this tent, the one who had seemed steadier after the conversation, who had seemed prepared. Sullivan was gone now, and his body remained in the ambush position because retrieving it was not tactically feasible under the continuing fire. Hayes also reported that Private Oscar Gutierrez had been wounded, struck in the lower leg by shrapnel or ricochet, and that Gutierrez was ambulatory but impaired. More critically, Hayes reported that the enemy force was not dispersing as hoped. Instead, it appeared to be consolidating, appearing to have established a more defensive posture rather than attempting to continue its movement. Hayes estimated that the enemy force was now attempting to pin the ambush unit in place, possibly preparing for a coordinated assault that could overwhelm the American position. Webb made the decision to move the reserve force north. 8 men, led by Sergeant Miller, moved out of the base camp at 9:35 hours, carrying additional ammunition and medical supplies, and moving at rapid pace along the route that Hayes' unit had taken. Ellison remained at the base camp with the remaining 2 men and the communication equipment, maintaining contact with headquarters and monitoring the situation. Webb moved with Miller's force, leaving written command authority with Ellison, but understanding that command decisions were too immediate, too dependent on ground-level observation, to be made from the base camp. The movement north took approximately 40 minutes, covering terrain that had become increasingly familiar over the past 2 days. The sound of gunfire grew louder as the reserve force approached the ambush position, echoing off the ridge walls, carrying with it the undertone of crisis. The ambush position itself was positioned on elevated ground, overlooking a narrow valley, terrain that Hayes had identified during reconnaissance as optimal for disrupting an enemy column. The position was roughly circular, with the 12 American personnel arranged in defensive formation, using rocks and fallen logs and hastily constructed positions to provide cover. When Webb arrived and moved into the position, the tactical situation became immediately clear. The enemy force had taken up position on the opposite ridge, perhaps 300 meters away, and had begun establishing a more comprehension that suggested preparation for a sustained engagement rather than an attempt to fight through the ambush. At least 2 machine guns were visible, their positions, marked by the regular patterns of fire, swept across the American positions. Sporadic rifle fire came from multiple points along the enemy ridge, fire that was not intense but was constant, maintaining suppression, preventing any American movement. Gutierrez was in the center of the position, his leg wrapped and elevated, his face pale, but his expression focused. He was still functional, still able to rifle, still contributing to the defense of the position. Sullivan's body was covered with a poncho, placed in a protected area of the position where it would not interfere with the ongoing defense. Webb moved to Hayes and conducted a rapid assessment. Hayes explained that the initial ambush had been effective, that the enemy force had sustained casualties, but that the force had adapted with tactical skill. Instead of attempting to break through or to disperse, the enemy had consolidated and had established the current defensive position. Hayes estimated that the enemy force now numbered between 40 and 60 personnel, that it appeared to have command structure and discipline, and that what was settling in for a sustained engagement rather than attempting immediate tactical resolution. The enemy was not attempting to assault the American position, but neither was it attempting to withdraw. It appeared to be establishing a siege posture, attempting to pin the Americans in place, possibly awaiting reinforcement, or waiting for darkness to attempt a coordinated assault. Webb understood the implications immediately. The ambush had been effective in disrupting the enemy operation, but it had created a new crisis. The American unit was pinned in an exposed position, outnumbered, and now facing the prospect of a night engagement terrain where the enemy might have numerical and tactical advantage. The helicopter extraction capability that had been held in reserve could be called forward, but any landing zone would be exposed to enemy fire from the ridge positions. The artillery support that had been coordinated with headquarters could be directed to the engagement area, but the civilian presence in the broader region, the abandoned settlements, the local population that had not entirely fled the area meant that indiscriminate fire was not acceptable. The tactical situation had shifted from ambush to siege, and the calculus of acceptable casualties had changed with it. At 15 hours, Webb made a second critical decision. He authorized Hayes to consolidate the position for defense, to establish fields of fire that would make any enemy assault prohibitively costly, and to maintain position while he returned to the base camp to coordinate with headquarters. The helicopter support would be moved closer, would be positioned for immediate evacuation capability. Artillery support would be coordinated with the understanding that the American force needed to be extracted from the position, that holding the position for an extended period was not tactically feasible, and was not worsenal casualties that would result. The objective of the operation had been achieved. The enemy force had been disrupted. The supply road operation had been warned of enemy activity. Intelligence had been gathered about the scale and organization of the enemy force. The price of continued engagement would be measured in American lives, and Webb understood that the price had already been substantial. The movement back to the base camp took 35 minutes. By 100 hours, Webb was in communication, Major Hollister at headquarters, explaining the tactical situation, requesting extraction authority for the ambush force, and recommending that the base camp operation be concluded. Hollister listened and approved the extraction. The helicopters would arrive at 400 hours, would land in the base camp and conduct the initial extraction of wounded and of the reserve force, and would then move to pick up the ambush force from an extraction point that could be established once the ambush unit had disengaged from the enemy position. The operation that had been planned as a 3-day reconnaissance mission was concluding after 2 days. 1 man dead, 1 man wounded, and the larger operational objectives partially completed. By 30 hours, the extraction was underway. The helicopters came in with covering fire from mounted weapons, came in fast and exposed, and left just as quickly with personnel and equipment loaded. Webb watched from the extraction point as the first helicopter lifted off, carrying the wounded Gutierrez and the reserve force that had been moved north to reinforce the ambush. He understood that he was witnessing the end of the operation, the beginning of the aftermath, and the settling into his consciousness of what his decision to split the force had cost. 1 man was dead. His family would receive a telegram. His name would be inscribed on a memorial somewhere, and the operation would be evaluated not on whether the objective was achieved, but on the price that was paid to achieve it. Webb waited for the second helicopter for the extraction of Hayes and the remaining ambush force, and understood that the true reckoning was only beginning. The after-action report was filed 3 days after the extraction, after Gutierrez had been evacuated to the field hospital and had undergone surgery on his leg, after Sullivan's body had been processed and prepared for the long journey home, after the unit had returned and had begun the work of cleaning weapons, inventorying supplies, and reassembling the routines that had been interrupted by the operation. Webb sat in the operations tent at the main depot, across from Major Hollister and from Colonel Samuel Pierce, who had arrived from divisional headquarters to conduct a preliminary investigation into the operation. The report itself was thorough, documented in the precise language that the military preferred: objective facts, timeline sequences, resource allocations, casualty figures, 1 killed in action, 1 wounded in action, enemy force estimated at 40 to 60 personnel, with unknown total casualties, supply line security enhanced through intelligence gathering and tactical disruption of suspected enemy operation, mission objective partially achieved, lesson learned documented, recommendations for future operations provided. Hollister asked the necessary questions about Webb's decision-making process, about the rationale for splitting the force rather than maintaining position at the base camp or committing the entire unit to the ambush. Webb answered directly, explaining the calculation that maintaining position would have allowed the enemy force to proceed unopposed, that committing the entire unit would have divided the operational force between ambush and base defense without clear advantage, that splitting the force allowed for partial engagement while maintaining extraction capability and reserve position strength. The logic was sound. The decision was defensible. And yet, the fact remained that Private Edward Sullivan was dead, and that fact had weight that no operational calculus could fully account for. Pierce listened without interrupting, his expression neutral in the way of senior officers who had learned to separate tactical decisions from their personal reactions to those decisions. When Webb finished, Pierce asked a single question: whether, knowing what he knew now, Webb would make the same decision. Webb took his time before answering. He said that he would make the same tactical decision, but that he would do so understanding more fully the cost of that decision. He said that the operation had been necessary, that the enemy force represented a genuine threat, and that the intelligence gathered had genuine value. But he also said that Sullivan's death was not merely an acceptable cost, it was a real loss, a loss. And that loss could not be fully reconciled with operational success. Pierce nodded and said that he would ensure the division commander understood that assessment. The meeting concluded, and Webb was released from the immediate scrutiny of higher command. The broader campaign context emerged over the following weeks. The intelligence gathered about the enemy force and its composition was distributed through divisional channels and incorporated into larger strategic assessments about enemy activity in the region. The supply line that the operation had been designed to protect continued its operations, and in the subsequent month, no enemy interdiction was attempted. Whether that was because of the disruption conducted by Webb's unit, or because of broader shifts in enemy activity, or because of other factors entirely, remained impossible to determine with certainty. The operation had been one element in a larger operational picture, and its influence on that picture was diffuse and difficult to measure. The strategic objective had been achieved. The supply line remained secure. The larger operation that depended on that supply line proceeded as planned. Sullivan's death had not been meaningless in the sense that something had been accomplished, but it also had not prevented larger tragedies. Other units suffered casualties in subsequent operations. The larger campaign proceeded with its own logic and momentum, barely disturbed by the events in the forward base camp. Webb returned to the base camp the day after the after-action report was filed. The tent where he had made the decision to split the force still stood, the map still marked with the positions where the ambush had been established. Hayes was there, having remained with the unit while the after-action investigation was conducted. Hayes reported that morale was stable but subdued. The men understood that they had accomplished the mission objective, understood that the casualty rate, 1 killed, 1 wounded out of a force of 12 engaged, was not catastrophic by military standards. But they also understood that Sullivan was gone, that Gutierrez would spend months in recovery, that the operation had been more difficult and more costly than the pre-operation assessment had suggested. There was no anger directed for the decision that had been made. Soldiers understood command decisions and understood the constraints that command operated under. But there was a wariness now, an understanding that routine operations could transform into something more dangerous, that the assumptions that had seemed solid could prove to be inadequate. Webb conducted individual debriefs with each member of the ambush force, listening to their accounts of what had occurred, understanding not the tactical sequence, but the personal experience of the engagement. Private Raymond Chen described the moment when Sullivan was struck, the sudden silence where noise had been before, the recognition of what had happened. Private James Whitmore talked about the fear during the siege period, about the constant awareness that an assault could come at any moment, about the discipline required to maintain fire discipline, and to avoid wasting ammunition, targets that could not be engaged effectively. Corporal Kwan, who had been the first to report the enemy movement, spoke about the burden of that initial intelligence. The knowledge that the information he had gathered had set in motion a series of events that had resulted in Sullivan's death. Webb listened and did not attempt to absolve Kwan or anyone else of the weight of that knowledge. He acknowledged what had occurred and acknowledged that the knowledge of it would remain with them. The unit went through another rotation cycle, with 3 men being rotated home due to completion of their tour and 3 replacements arriving from the training pipeline. Sullivan's replacement was a private named David Morrison, a young man from rural Pennsylvania who had never been to the Pacific before and who was learning military culture while trying to fit into a unit that had been fundamentally altered by recent experience. Webb made a point of ensuring that Morrison understood the unit's operating procedures, understood the standards that the unit maintained, but also understood that the unit had just lost a member, and that sensitivity to that loss was appropriate. Morrison listened carefully and tried to fit into a role that had been vacated by circumstances beyond his control. By the end of the month, the routine operations had resumed. Patrols moved out in the morning and returned in the afternoon. Intelligence was gathered, processed, and reported. The supply line continued its operations. The base camp settled into the patterns that had existed before, but with subtle differences. The men moved with slightly more caution. The briefings paid slightly more attention to contingency planning. Webb made tactical adjustments based on what the operation had taught him about the actual range of threat in the region, and somewhere in Webb's consciousness, in the part of his mind that did not shut off at night, there remained the knowledge that the decision had been made, the cost had been paid, and the consequence had been permanent. On a quiet evening in late October, Webb sat outside the operations tent, looking out toward the distant ridges where the ambush had been conducted. Hayes approached and sat down without asking permission, which was the privilege of long service and trusted relationship. They sat in silence for a while, and then Hayes spoke, saying that he had received word that Gutierrez would be able to return to limited duty after his recovery, that his leg had healed better than initially expected. Webb acknowledged this and asked about Gutierrez's psychological state. Hayes said that Gutierrez was processing it, that Gutierrez understood that he had been in a situation where things could have ended very differently, but not something was something take for granted. Webb nodded and said nothing more. The conversation did not need to continue. They had both made the choices that they had made, had lived with the consequences, and had understood that the operation would be filed away into the past while remaining, in some fundamental way, part of who they had become. Webb understood that the decision to split the force had likely been correct from a purely tactical perspective. The enemy force had been disrupted, the supply line had been protected, the larger operation had succeeded, but he also understood that tactical correctness did not absolve him of the weight of consequence. Sullivan was dead. That fact existed independently of whether the operation had been tactically sound. The decision had been made under real constraints, with incomplete information, and with the knowledge that any decision would have carried costs. Webb had chosen the path that seemed to minimize some costs while accepting others. That was the nature of command, to make choices that could not be unmade, to live with the consequences of those choices, and to carry forward into future decisions the knowledge of what those consequences had been. The operation was concluded. The reckoning would continue indefinitely.